The emergency room doors hadn't even finished swinging open when Officer Marcus Vell grabbed her by the arm. She had blood on her hands, blood on her scrubs. Blood streaked up her forearms to her elbows like she'd reached inside someone and tried to hold their heart together, because she had. But Marcus Vell didn't see a nurse. He didn't see someone who'd just dragged 4 people out of a burning vehicle on Interstate 84 with nothing but her bare hands and a trauma kit. He saw a threat. He saw something to control. "Get on the ground," he said. "Now." The fluorescent lights of Hargrove Memorial Hospital hummed overhead. 31-year-old nurse Mara Solano stood perfectly still, hands raised, eyes steady, pulse slow. She'd been in worse places than this, much worse. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or pushed aside, stay with me until the end. Like this video, drop your city in the comments, and let me see how far this story travels. The rain had started somewhere around mile marker 47, the kind of Pacific Northwest downpour that turned headlights into blurs and made the road feel like it was breathing. Mara Solano had seen storms like this before, in places where the rain came sideways and the thunder rolled in from mountains that didn't have names on any American map. She'd learned to drive through bad weather without flinching. Most things didn't make her flinch anymore. She was 12 minutes from the end of a 14-hour shift when she saw the smoke. It rose above the tree line first, orange, gray, and thick, the way fire looks when it's eating something it isn't supposed to eat. She was already slowing before she registered the decision. The crash itself came into view seconds later. 2 vehicles, a white SUV folded nearly in half against the concrete divider, and a minivan that had rolled twice and come to rest on its side in the right lane, hazards blinking uselessly into the rain, glass everywhere, one tire spinning, a car seat visible through a shattered rear window. Mara pulled onto the shoulder, put her hazards on, and was out of her car before the engine stopped ticking. She wasn't thinking about being 12 minutes from home. She wasn't thinking about the 14 hours already burning in her legs and her lower back. That part of her brain, the tired, civilian, please let me sleep part, had gone quiet the moment she saw the smoke. Something older had taken over. Something trained into muscle and reflex across 2 deployments and more trauma bays than she could count. She moved to the minivan first because the car seat was there. The child was conscious, which was either very good or complicated. A girl, maybe 4 years old, suspended sideways in her harness, crying but not screaming. The kind of quiet, bewildered crying that meant she hadn't fully understood yet that something terrible had happened. Mara reached through the broken window, checked the child's neck and collarbone by touch, assessed responsiveness by voice. Hey, sweetheart. Can you squeeze my hand? Like this." The girl squeezed. "Good. That's really good. I'm going to get you out, okay? Don't move your head." The father was pinned in the driver's seat, conscious, breathing, a gash above his left eye running blood in sheets. He was trying to turn toward his daughter and couldn't, and the effort was making things worse. Sir, look at me." Mara pressed her hand flat against the door frame, made eye contact through the shattered glass. "She's okay. She's talking to me. I need you to stay still because if you move your neck right now—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He stopped moving. She had a trauma kit in her car. It was the kind of thing she'd started carrying 3 years ago after a bad accident on Route 26, where she'd watched a man bleed out on the asphalt because the nearest ambulance was 18 minutes away. The kit wasn't stocked the way a field kit was. Nothing was. But it had what she needed for the next 10 minutes. She called 911 as she worked, reported the location and the vehicle count and what she could see. The dispatcher asked if she had medical training. She said yes and left it at that. There were 4 people total: the father, the daughter, a teenage boy in the back seat who'd hit his head and gone in and out of consciousness twice, and the driver of the SUV, a woman in her 50s, who'd been ejected partially through the windshield and was now sitting on the wet asphalt, right arm at a wrong angle, talking to herself in a loop about whether she'd left the stove on. Mara triaged them in her head the way she'd been taught: immediate, delayed, minimal, expectant. She talked all 4 of them through the next 22 minutes until the ambulances arrived, keeping voices calm and hands moving, applying pressure where she needed to, keeping the SUV driver's arm immobilized with strips torn from her own jacket. She got blood on everything. When the paramedics pulled up and she handed off the father, the lead EMT looked at her scrubs and then at her face. "You're a nurse?" "Yes." "You work around here?" "Hargrove Memorial? I'm on my way in." She paused. On my way back." He nodded, already moving. She stepped back and let the professionals do the part that required gurneys and IVs and space she couldn't provide on a wet highway shoulder. She stood in the rain for another few minutes because there wasn't anywhere obvious to go, and then she got back in her car. She sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, rain on the windshield, heart rate coming down from wherever it had gone. Then she drove to the hospital because her personal kit needed restocking, and there was a cut on her own forearm she hadn't noticed until now that probably needed a look. Hargrove Memorial Hospital sat on the western edge of Clover Falls, Oregon, a medium-sized city that liked to describe itself as where the valley meets the mountain, which was the kind of thing Clover Falls said on tourism brochures and meant almost nothing in practice. The hospital was a Level 2 trauma center, which made it the most serious medical facility within 40 miles, and on a rainy Thursday night in November, it had the controlled chaos of any ER that knew weather was coming and had braced for it. The parking structure was full. Mara left her car in the overflow lot and crossed the wet concrete toward the employee entrance, her ID badge clipped to a collar that was now half soaked, her scrubs doing what bloody wet scrubs do, which is to say they looked exactly as bad as they were. She almost didn't notice the patrol car parked sideways near the ambulance bay. Almost. Officer Marcus Vell had been working Clover Falls PD for 6 years. He was 38, built like someone who'd played college ball and never quite let go of the identity. And he had the particular energy of a man who entered rooms slightly too fast and talked slightly too loud, and had mistaken that quality for authority so many times that it had become indistinguishable from his actual personality. He was assigned to hospital security liaison 3 nights a week, a rotation that was supposed to improve police-hospital coordination and mostly resulted in Vell treating the ER like his personal jurisdiction. He saw Mara coming through the rain, and he stepped out from under the overhang. She didn't stop walking. She had her ID out. Hey, hold on." She slowed. "I work here. Badge is right here." "I can see that." He didn't look at the badge. He was looking at her hands, her arms, the state of her scrubs. His right hand had moved to his belt without him seeming to notice it. "What happened to you?" "Car accident on I-84. I stopped to help. I'm a nurse. You stopped to help." He repeated it the way people repeat things when they've already decided not to believe them. "Yes, there were 4 people. The paramedics have them now. I just need to go inside and I'm going to need you to stay right here." Mara stopped walking. She looked at him. Not angry, or not obviously angry. There was something in her face that was harder to name. The stillness of someone who has run all the calculations and knows exactly where this is going. "I work here," she said again, steady. "You can call the charge nurse, Sandra Wick. She'll confirm my shift. I'll do that from out here. Right now I need you to—" He gestured, a vague directing motion that managed to be condescending and unclear simultaneously. "Step over there, away from the entrance. I have a cut on my arm that I need to look at." "I can see that. Step over there." She stepped. She knew how to pick fights, and she knew how to not pick fights in this, on a wet sidewalk at 11:40 at night with blood already drying on her skin, was not the time. What she didn't expect was Vell keying his radio and calling for backup. For her. For a woman in scrubs with a hospital badge standing outside the hospital where she worked. The backup arrived in the form of Officer Dana Pruitt, who was younger than Vell and had the expression of someone who hadn't yet decided how she felt about the situation and was waiting for more information before committing. She stood near the entrance while Vell ran Mara's name through dispatch, a process that should have taken 4 minutes and stretched to 11, because Vell kept asking questions instead of just waiting. "You said you stopped at the accident." "Yes." "You were driving home from your shift?" "Yes." "What time did your shift start?" 9 a.m. yesterday." A pause. "You worked a 14-hour shift." 14 and a half, roughly. "And you just stopped. On the highway." She looked at him. There was a car seat in the window. He wrote something down. She couldn't see what it was, which was probably intentional. The ER entrance doors opened and Anita Marsh came out. She was the nursing supervisor for the evening, a compact woman in her early 50s with reading glasses pushed up into her silver-streaked hair, the kind of person who'd been in emergency medicine long enough to have opinions about almost everything and the experience to back most of them up. She took one look at the situation, Mara standing in the rain, Vel with his notepad, Pruitt near the door, and her expression shifted into something that wasn't quite concern and wasn't quite irritation, but was somewhere between them. "Mara, what's going on?" "Your officer here can explain it," Vel said before Mara could answer. "She's not my officer," Anita said. "She's my nurse, one of my best." She looked at Mara's arm. "You need that cleaned and closed." "I'm aware." "Officer," Anita turned to Vel. "Whatever you need to verify about her employment, I can verify it right now. She's been on staff for 3 years. She did a 14-hour shift today. She's been cleared for trauma work. What else do you need?" "I need her to wait until I'm done with my assessment." "Your assessment of what?" Vel's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, there's been an incident on I-84, which she apparently helped with. That's not an incident with her. That's her doing her job outside of her job." Anita crossed her arms. "It's cold and it's raining and she's bleeding. Can we move this inside?" "No." The word landed flat, final. Vel said it the way people say things when they've decided that being challenged is the same as being disrespected, and they're not going to give an inch now because giving an inch means losing something they can't afford to lose. Anita looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Mara. Something passed between them. Mara had worked under Anita for 3 years, and in that time she'd learned to read the woman's silences. This one said, "I will fight this, but not tonight, not here, not in a way that makes it worse for you right now." "Fine," Anita said. "I'll be right inside. You need anything? You call." She looked at Vel one more time, not a threat exactly, but not nothing, and went back through the doors. Vel went back to his notepad. Mara stood in the rain. Tchim. She'd been standing outside for 23 minutes when the doors opened again, and Vel's backup shifted from Dana Pruitt to something she hadn't expected. Gary Ellison, the hospital's head of security, who came out with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face set into the particular blankness of a man who had been pulled into a situation he hadn't started and wasn't sure how to finish. Gary had been head of security at Hargrove for 11 years. He knew Mara. He'd worked with her during 2 separate code situations and one genuine security incident involving an intoxicated patient who'd gotten into the medication storage. He knew she was competent, calm, and not a threat to anything except the paperwork that came with difficult nights. But he also knew Marcus Vel. He knew the way Vel operated in this building, the way he expanded into whatever space he was given, the way he treated the hospital's staff like suspects who hadn't been caught yet, the way complaints about his conduct had been filed and reviewed and filed again without much happening. Gary looked at Mara. She looked back. "Ms. Solano," he said, formal, careful. "Gary." He cleared his throat. "Officer Vel has some concerns about the situation, and I think, He paused, choosing words. "I think it would probably be better for everyone if you waited in the staff lounge until this is resolved." She looked at him for a long moment. Not at Vel, at Gary. "You're asking me to go wait in the staff lounge?" "Just until, because he has concerns." "Mara, I have a laceration on my forearm, Gary. I've been standing out here for..." She glanced at her watch. 24 minutes, in the rain. Gary's jaw moved slightly, the way people's jaws move when they're about to say something they know is wrong but don't have the tools to say something right. "I understand that," he said. "I do. But given the circumstances..." "What circumstances? What are the circumstances specifically?" He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. "Fine," she said. The word came out the same way Vel's had. Flat, final. But it meant something completely different. It wasn't authority. It was the sound of someone making a decision about who they were dealing with and what that meant going forward. She walked past Gary, past Vel, and through the employee entrance. No one stopped her. Vel called something after her that she didn't catch, and she didn't turn around. Inside, the ER was running at the kind of controlled chaos volume that told her the overnight crew was stretched. She could feel it, that particular atmospheric pressure of a department that's keeping up, but only just. She knew the sound of it. She knew the way the halls tasted different when the board was full and the wait times were climbing. She went to the staff bathroom, ran her arm under water, cleaned the laceration with what was in the cabinet, decided it didn't need closure strips, and taped a piece of gauze over it with medical tape from the counter. The whole thing took 5 minutes. When she came out, Dana Pruitt was standing in the hallway. "Miss Solano." She sounded younger than she'd looked outside. "I want you to know I'm sorry about how that went. Out there." Mara looked at her. The woman was maybe 26, 27, still figuring out the shape of the job, still deciding what kind of officer she wanted to be. "Do you know what I was doing out there tonight?" Mara said. Pruitt nodded. "I heard. The accident. I was there for 22 minutes before EMS arrived. I managed 4 patients simultaneously. One of them had a potential spinal injury. One had been ejected from a vehicle and had a compound fracture. One was a child in a car seat." She paused. "I've handled worse than that with fewer resources." Pruitt was quiet. "I'm not saying this for sympathy," Mara said. "I'm saying it so you understand what your colleague pulled me away from, to stand in the rain and be treated like a suspect." She let that sit for a second. "I need to go restock my kit." She went to the supply room and didn't look back. The supply room was off the main trauma corridor, a narrow space that smelled like sealed packaging, and the particular clinical cleanness of anything kept sterile. Mara had restocked her kit exactly twice before under calmer circumstances. Tonight she did it methodically, and without thinking much, her hands moving by routine, her mind starting to decompress from the hours behind her. She was almost done when she heard the voices in the corridor outside. Vel. And someone else. A man she recognized after a moment as Dr. Preston Hale, the attending on duty, whose voice had the slightly elevated register of someone making a point they were confident about. "Not going to stand here and tell you she's a security concern, Marcus, because she isn't." The call came in about a woman matching her description at the scene. The call was about a nurse who stopped to help at an accident scene. That's what she is. That's what she was doing. "I'm not done verifying." "You've been verifying for 30 minutes. You've pulled her supervisor outside. You've had her standing in the rain, and now she's in my supply room instead of going home like she should be after a 14-hour shift. Doctor, I understand your frustration." "I don't think you do." Hale's voice had gone quieter, which in Mara's experience meant he was either calming down or getting more serious. This sounded like the second one. "She's staff. She's been staff here for 3 years. She's never had a conduct issue. She's never had a patient complaint. This isn't about her record." "Then what is it about?" A pause. A long one. "There have been reports," Vel said, "from multiple incidents of a woman. You keep saying a woman, fitting her description. What does her description have to do with what happened on I-84 tonight? Tell me that specifically." Another pause. Mara stood very still. She'd been doing that a lot tonight, standing still while other people filled the air around her. It was a skill she'd developed over years, in environments where moving wrong had consequences she wasn't willing to accept. You learned to measure when movement helped and when it didn't. You learned to wait. She heard Vel say, lower. She was at the scene before EMS arrived. "She's a nurse. She stopped to help. There's no record of her. She doesn't need a record. She doesn't need your permission. She pulled 4 people out of a crash and then she drove to work." Hale's voice had gone very quiet now, which was somehow louder than anything else. "That's who you've been standing in the rain for the last half hour." There was a long silence. Then Vel said, "I still need to complete my report." She heard footsteps. One set moving away, one set remaining. She went back to restocking her kit. Uktapa. She was almost to her car when she heard it, a sound she'd been trained to recognize before she understood what it was, before her conscious brain had processed it as information. The specific frequency of emergency radio traffic, multiple units, multiple locations being referenced simultaneously. She stopped, pulled out her phone, checked the scanner app she kept installed for exactly the kind of night this had been. I-84. Multiple vehicle collision. Mass casualty protocol being initiated. Not a small accident. Not the kind of thing where 4 people needed her. The kind of thing where they were calling in every available unit because there weren't enough hands. She stood in the parking lot for 3 seconds. Then she turned around and went back inside. The ER had shifted in the 90 seconds she'd been outside. She could feel it before she pushed through the doors, that change in atmospheric density that came when a department went from managing chaos to bracing for it. Someone was calling overhead for trauma team assembly. A nurse she recognized, Tommy Briggs, 7 years on the overnight rotation, was moving fast toward the trauma bay with the expression of a man who'd just been told his night had changed. "Tommy," she caught him. "What are they saying?" "Pile up on I-84. Bus and 3 passenger vehicles. They're calling at least 11 incoming." 11. She looked down the corridor, looked at the board, counted the staff she could see versus the staff they'd need. "I need a radio," she said. "Mara, you're not technically on—" "I know, I need a radio." He handed her one from his belt without further argument because Tommy Briggs had worked with her long enough to know when to ask questions and when not to. She clipped it to her waistband and started walking toward the trauma bay, already running triage in her head, categories, capacities, what Hargrove could absorb, and what would need to be rerouted. 11 incoming across a level 2 facility at midnight with a staff already stretched from a full day. She was almost at the bay doors when Marcus Vell stepped in front of her. "I told you to wait. Move. Ms. Solano, you are not authorized. There are 11 trauma patients incoming. Move." He didn't move. He actually took a step toward her, which was when something in the hallway around them went quiet in a way that hallways rarely did. She looked at him. He was taller by 4 inches and outweighed her by 60 pounds, and had a badge and a gun and whatever authority he believed those things conferred. She stood with her hands at her sides and her face absolutely still, and she looked at him the way she had learned to look at things that were in her way, not with anger because anger was expensive, but with the kind of clarity that came from knowing exactly what the situation required and being prepared to do it. "You don't know who I am," she said quietly. Not a threat, a statement of fact. "I know who you are. You know my name. You know what I look like. You know my badge number." She held his gaze. "You don't know who I am." The radio on her waistband crackled. Tommy's voice from inside the bay. "Mara, we need you in here. Now!" Vell held his position for one more second. Then the ambulance bay doors at the far end of the corridor burst open. The first gurney came through fast, paramedics calling vitals. A man in his 40s losing consciousness mid-roll. Behind him, a second gurney. A third. The hallway filled with the controlled noise of people who had jobs to do and no time to do anything else. Mara stepped around Vell. He reached for her arm. She was already through the trauma bay doors. The trauma bay had a sound to it on bad nights. Not loud exactly, but dense. Layered. The beeping of monitors competing with voices calling numbers. The mechanical percussion of equipment being moved fast. The particular rhythm of people who'd done this enough times that efficiency had replaced panic. Mara knew that sound the way she knew her own heartbeat. She stepped into it, and it absorbed her. The man from the first gurney, 40s, construction jacket, blood coming from somewhere above his hairline that the paramedics hadn't been able to fully assess in transit, was going critical. His pressure was dropping. The resident on duty, a second year named Ellis Cho, was competent and moving and also very clearly on the edge of the kind of overwhelm that happened when the numbers didn't match the capacity. "GCS dropped to 9 in the rig," the paramedic was calling out. "BP's 80/50 and sliding. We think internal." Ellis was reaching for the chart, talking to the circulating nurse, trying to be 3 places at once. Mara was already at the head of the bed. "Ellis, eyes on me." He looked up. She was already assessing, airway clear, breathing labored on the left side, the way the man's abdomen sat wrong under the jacket. "Splenic, maybe liver. We need imaging now, but he won't make it to CT if we don't get a line in and pressure up. You want me on the line, or do you want to call it?" Ellis stared at her for half a second, the half second of a person recalibrating. He knew she was off shift. He knew about the situation in the hall. None of that was useful information right now. "Line," he said. "I'll call it." She had the IV in before he finished the sentence. They worked. The room worked. That's the only way to describe what happened in the next 40 minutes. Not smoothly, not perfectly, because nothing in a mass casualty response is smooth or perfect. Bags of saline ran out faster than expected. One of the monitors threw a false reading that cost them 90 seconds of confusion. A second patient came in with injuries that looked minor and weren't, and the triage had to be renegotiated on the fly. Tommy Briggs took a call from another incoming unit and had to shout the update across the bay because the radio traffic was full. Mara moved through all of it. She took the tasks nobody was explicitly assigned because she knew how to read a room for gaps, where the hands weren't, where the attention had drifted, where something was about to go wrong because everyone's eyes were somewhere else. She'd done it in tents. She'd done it in the back of vehicles moving over roads that weren't roads. She'd done it in an FOB medical unit at 2 a.m. when the casualties came in faster than the paperwork and you stopped counting and just started working. She didn't announce herself. She didn't explain. She moved and the work moved with her. At some point, she became aware that Marcus Vell was standing in the doorway of the trauma bay. She was aware of him the way you're aware of weather, as a condition of the environment, something to account for without letting it interrupt the primary task. He was watching. His arms were crossed. His expression had changed from the aggressive, forward-leaning certainty he'd worn in the hallway to something harder to read. Not remorse. Not quite. But the look of a man whose version of the situation was encountering friction. She didn't look at him directly. She had a patient. The man with the suspected splenic injury, his name turned out to be Robert Okafor, which she learned from his wallet when they cut his jacket open, stabilized enough to move to imaging 22 minutes in. Not out of danger, not even close, but stable enough that the immediate crisis had a different shape. Ellis exhaled next to her. The kind of exhale that people don't usually make in front of other people because it carries too much information about how scared they'd been. That was... He stopped, started again. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. He needs a surgeon. I've already called. Good. She pulled off the gloves, reached for a new pair. There were 9 more patients still incoming or already in the department. She didn't have time to process Robert Okafor's close call, or Ellis's exhale, or the fact that her arm was throbbing under the taped gauze. What's next on the board? Yet. It took Anita Marsh about 15 minutes to find her, which was longer than Mara expected. When Anita came through the door, she had her supervisor face on. The one that was designed to convey calm authority, and occasionally actually did. You're not on shift, Anita said. I know. You can't be in here officially. I know that too. Anita looked around the bay. She counted the patients, the staff, the resources relative to what was needed. She was good at that kind of math. She'd been doing it for 20 years. How long can you stay? She said finally. As long as you need me. Anita nodded once, the way people nod when they've already decided but needed the conversation to get there. I'll deal with the paperwork in the morning. What about Vell? Anita's expression did something complicated. He's been on the phone with his supervisor for the last 10 minutes. She paused. I've been on the phone with the chief medical officer. Mara looked at her. Doctor, Harlan takes mass casualty response very seriously, Anita said, with the particular careful tone of someone relaying information that carries more weight than the words themselves. He's aware of what happened in the corridor tonight. She left it there. Mara understood what she was leaving there. She went back to work. The bus passengers started arriving in the second wave, and that's when the real triage pressure hit. A charter bus had been clipped by a jackknifed semi and gone into the median. Not a rollover, mercifully, but the abrupt stop had done what abrupt stops do to bodies that aren't properly braced. Whiplash injuries everywhere. 3 people with broken bones. 1 woman, mid-60s, with a head injury that was behaving in ways that made the overnight neurology resident very unhappy on the phone. An elderly man who'd had what looked like a cardiac event during or possibly before the impact, timeline unclear, and whose family, a daughter who'd been in the seat behind him, was in the waiting room alternating between demanding information and asking to speak to someone in charge. Mara passed the waiting room twice without stopping. The third time, the daughter, a woman her own age, dark circles under her eyes, still in the emergency jacket she'd grabbed on the way to the bus, saw her, and stood up fast. "Are you a doctor? Can you tell me what's happening? They won't tell us anything." "I'm a nurse. What's your father's name?" "Daniel Ferris. He's 71. He has a pacemaker." Mara stopped, turned. "When was his last cardiology appointment?" The woman blinked. She hadn't expected a specific question. 3 months ago. They adjusted his medication. He's on... She pulled out her phone with shaking hands, found something. "Metoprolol, 50 milligrams. Anyone know about the pacemaker?" "I told the paramedic. I told him twice." "Okay, I'm going to make sure the attending has that." She held the woman's gaze for a second. "His name is Dr. Cho. He's good. That's not something I say to make you feel better. It's accurate." The woman sat down slowly. "Thank you." Mara was already moving. She relayed the information to Ellis, who swore quietly and went to confirm the pacemaker model with radiology before they did anything that might interact with it. It was the kind of detail that could have been missed, the kind that sometimes was missed, the kind that on a different night, with a different sequence of events, might not have reached the right person in time. She didn't think about that too hard. Around 2 in the morning, the bay hit a strange plateau, the kind that happened in long emergencies, where the acute peak had passed and the sustained effort of managing what remained settled in. Not calm, not even close to calm, but a different texture of chaos, slower and more grinding. The patients who were going to require immediate surgical intervention had gone upstairs. The patients who were stable had been moved to observation. What remained were the complicated middle cases, the ones that needed monitoring and decisions, and the kind of sustained clinical attention that wore people down in a different way than emergencies did. Mara was checking a monitor reading on the elderly woman with the head injury. Her name was Patricia, which Mara learned because she kept saying it. "Keep calling myself by my name." One of her daughters had told her once that it helped orient you, and Patricia had decided tonight was a night to try it, when she heard Vel's voice in the corridor again. Not the radio and notepad voice he'd used with her. A different one. Lower, directed. She moved to where she could hear without being in the doorway. He was talking to Gary Ellison. The security chief had apparently been in the building this whole time, which she hadn't known, and his voice had the quality of a man who was trying to manage a situation that had outgrown the tools he had for managing it. "Can't just let her operate in there without authorization." "She has authorization," Gary said. "Anita Marsh authorized her. So did Dr. Harlan." "She didn't have authorization when she pushed past me." "Marcus." Gary's voice dropped. "We have 11 trauma patients from a mass casualty event, and one of my best nurses is in there helping handle them. I need you to understand what the priority is right now." "My priority is..." "Your priority right now is not making this worse." A pause. "I'm asking you, professionally, let it sit until morning and we'll sort out whatever needs sorting." A long silence. "There are complaints," Vel said. Lower. The kind of lower that meant he knew the statement was significant. "Documented ones. About her. From previous what?" No answer. "From previous what, Marcus?" "Incidents where she escalated, where her behavior created..." "I've seen Mara Solano's file," Gary said flatly. "Every review she's ever had. Not one complaint, not one." Another silence. Longer. "I'm filing a report," Vel said. "File whatever you need to file. That's your right." Gary's voice was tired, just tired. "Go wait in the security office. I'll come find you in an hour." She heard footsteps, singular, moving away. She stood where she was for a moment. Complaints. Documented ones. She ran back through every interaction she'd had with Vel, which were more than tonight. 2 previous security responses in the ER, where he'd been assigned. One involving a patient who'd become combative, one involving a staff dispute that hadn't involved her directly, but that she'd been nearby for. She thought about those encounters, and she thought about what he might have written down, and she thought about the word escalated in his mouth and what that was doing in a sentence about her. Then she went back to check on Patricia, who was still saying her own name quietly into the ceiling. The shift supervisor who came on at 6 a.m. was a man named Ron Taggart, who had been doing ER administration at Hargrove for 9 years and had the slightly weathered affect of someone who'd learned to read bad news from the body language of the people delivering it. He walked in at 5:58 to the tail end of the night's events, received a 20-minute handoff briefing from Anita Marsh, and then came looking for Mara. She was in the break room, not eating, not really resting. Sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, her forearm on the table, the gauze peeling at one edge. She was looking at nothing in particular. It was the specific exhausted vacancy that people fell into when the thing that had been holding them upright was no longer required and the body hadn't figured out what to replace it with. Mara. Taggart sat across from her without asking. He was the kind of person who sat across from people in break rooms. It was part of his management style. Hell of a night. It was manageable. 11 trauma patients, mass casualty protocol. You worked through it off shift. I was here. It needed to be done. He nodded, looking at his hands. Anita told me about the situation with Officer Vell. She didn't respond. I want you to know that Dr. Harlan's office called me at 4:30 a.m. That's not something that happens. He's going to want to meet this morning whenever you're ready. She looked up. About what? About all of it. Taggart shifted his weight. He had the look of someone navigating terrain he hadn't mapped. About Vell's conduct, about the documentation he apparently tried to generate on you, about... He stopped. There's something else. She waited. Vell filed his report last night, before Gary could get to him. He paused. He flagged you as a security concern, official filing. She looked at him. He included in the report that you, quote, forced your way into a restricted medical area in defiance of an active police instruction. The break room was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, someone's radio crackled. He said I forced my way into the trauma bay. Yes. During a mass casualty response. Yes. She looked at her cold coffee. She had been awake for over 20 hours. Her arm was still bleeding slightly under the gauze. She had spent half the night managing patients that nobody else had the hands for, and there was now an official police report framing that as a security breach. She thought about a lot of things in that moment. She thought about what it felt like to be somewhere where people actively tried to kill you, and you managed it because you'd trained for it, and because the training mattered, and because some things were worth doing regardless of whether anyone acknowledged you for doing them. She thought about the space between that kind of work and this kind of work, which wasn't as large as people assumed. She thought about what Vell had written and why he'd written it and what it said about him that he'd looked at last night and turned it into that. Okay, she said. Taggart blinked. Okay? I want a copy of his report. She stood up. And I want to meet with Dr. Harlan at whatever time works for him. Yes, of course. He stood too. Mara, how are you doing? It was a genuine question. He wasn't performing concern. He was actually asking. She recognized the difference. I'm tired, she said, and I need someone to look at this arm. She held it up, the gauze, the tape starting to give. And then I have things to take care of. She left him standing at the table. Dr. Harlan's office was on the 4th floor, which was the administrative floor, which meant it had carpeting instead of linoleum and windows that actually faced something other than the parking structure. Leonard Harlan was 62, a cardiologist by training who transitioned into hospital administration 15 years ago, and he had the particular quality of men who'd spent decades making decisions about things that mattered. He listened to the whole sentence before he started forming his response. He was on the phone when she arrived, and he held up one finger, 1 minute, and she sat in the chair across from his desk and waited. He hung up, looked at her. Tell me what happened, he said. Start from the accident. She told him. All of it, in order, without editorializing. The crash on I-84. The 4 patients, driving to the hospital, Vell in the parking lot, the 23 minutes in the rain, Gary Ellison, the supply room, the mass casualty response, the corridor, the report. Harlan listened. His expression didn't move much, not in a cold way, but in the way of someone who's learned to receive information before reacting to it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. How long have you been at Hargrove? He asked. 3 years and 4 months. And in that time, Vell has been involved in... He opened something on his screen. 3 separate security responses that you were present for. 2 where I was directly involved, 1 adjacent. He nodded. There are 2 complaints on file that his unit filed regarding those incidents. Both listing you as, he scrolled, an uncooperative staff member who impeded officer authority during emergency response. She kept her face even. I saw those for the first time this morning. You didn't know about them? No. He closed the screen, looked at her directly. I've spoken this morning with the shift supervisor from each of those incidents, and with 2 nurses who were present. The description of events in Vel's filings doesn't match what I heard from those conversations. He paused. Doesn't match at all. She said nothing. She was waiting for where he was going. We have a body cam policy that applies to officer liaisons working in this facility, Harlan said. Vel's unit was asked to provide the footage from last night. They've declined, pending their own internal review. They've declined. Temporarily, but given that we have... He stopped. Seemed to be choosing words carefully. Given that 2 nurses captured portions of last night's corridor incident on their personal phones, and given that those recordings are now being reviewed by our legal department, the Clover Falls PD's Internal Affairs Office will have some questions. The room was quiet. I also had an interesting call this morning, Harlan said, and something in his tone shifted, just slightly, barely detectable. From a contact at the 82nd Airborne Medical Brigade's liaison office. They were attempting to reach a nurse at this facility. He looked at her. A Lieutenant Mara Solano. She went very still. Harlan watched her face. He wasn't surprised by the stillness, which meant he'd already known, or suspected, or the phone call had told him something she hadn't. They said they had an alert, he said. An emergency identification flag attached to a secure medical ID number. They said it was triggered last night. He folded his hands on the desk. Would you like to tell me about that? She looked at him for a long moment. From somewhere below them, 4 floors down, in a parking lot she couldn't see, she heard the sound of vehicles pulling in. Not ambulances. Something different. The sound of engines that had a particular weight to them, a particular deliberateness. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. A number she recognized, a number she hadn't seen in 8 months. She looked back up at Harlan. I think, she said slowly, you're about to have some visitors. Harlan's office had a window that faced the south parking structure, and when Mara stood up from her chair and moved toward it, she could see them clearly. 3 vehicles. Black. The kind of black that wasn't a color choice so much as a statement. Flat finish government plates, no insignia visible from this distance, but the geometry of the SUVs was specific enough that anyone who'd spent time around military logistics would recognize what they were looking at. They pulled into the reserved lane with the unhurried precision of people who didn't need to rush because they'd already made all the decisions before they arrived. 4 figures got out. Civilian clothes, but the way they moved wasn't civilian. The posture, the spacing, the way they oriented to each other and to the entrance simultaneously, that was trained into people, not picked up. Her phone buzzed again. Same number. She answered. Lieutenant? The voice was Colonel James Rourke, which she knew before he said his name because she'd worked under him for 14 months in a medical support unit attached to the 82nd, and she'd learned the specific cadence of how he talked when he was in motion, measured, efficient, no introduction needed. Colonel, we're at your location. You triggered the flag. I didn't trigger it intentionally. I know. The system flagged an unauthorized secondary ID query attached to your medical credentials. Someone ran your name through a channel they didn't have clearance for. A pause. We take that seriously. She turned away from the window. Harlan was watching her with the expression of a man recalibrating several assumptions simultaneously. Someone ran my credentials, she said, at 11:47 p.m. last night, through a Clover Falls PD dispatch terminal. Rourke's voice was flat, informational. The query included a request for service history and medical clearance records. Those aren't accessible through that terminal under any circumstances. The attempt itself generated the flag. She stood very still. 11:47. While she was standing in the rain, while Vel was at his patrol car with his notepad and his radio, running her name through dispatch. Colonel, she said carefully, what exactly did the query try to access? Your full military medical record, deployment history, psychological evaluations, Security clearance documentation. Another pause, shorter. Someone was looking for something they could use. She thought about the word escalated in Vel's mouth. She thought about the word complaints. She thought about 2 reports filed against her over 3 separate incidents, none of which she'd ever been officially informed of, all of which painted her as a problem. Someone had been building something, not last night, before last night. I need about 10 minutes, she told Rourke. Take what you need. We're not going anywhere. She hung up, turned to Harlan. The officer who filed the report against me last night, she said. He ran my military credentials through dispatch, tried to access records he had no authorization to look at. She watched Harlan's face process that. That triggered an alert with a military liaison unit. Those are the people downstairs. Harlan was quiet for 3 full seconds. He tried to access your military records. My full service file. Deployment history, psych evaluations. Harlan stood up from his desk slowly, the way people stand up when they realize the ground they were standing on was a different shape than they thought. He reached for his phone. I'm calling legal, he said. I think you should also call the chief of police, Mara said, before this gets managed from the bottom up. He looked at her, nodded once, made the call. She met Rourke in the lobby. He was 54, gray at the temples, and had the kind of face that didn't offer much regardless of circumstances. He'd been her commanding officer during the worst 6 months of her second deployment, which meant she'd seen him in situations that stripped most people down to whatever they actually were. And what he actually was turned out to be someone who thought clearly under pressure and didn't waste words. She'd respected him enormously and found him occasionally infuriating, which seemed about right for the people who shaped you. You look terrible, he said when she walked up. I've been awake for 22 hours. I know, I saw your shift record. He handed her a tablet, not a greeting, just information transfer, which was how he operated. Your credentials were queried by a terminal registered to Officer Marcus Vell, Clover Falls PD, badge number 4471. The query attempted to access 5 separate restricted record categories. It failed on all 5 because none of those categories are accessible through civilian law enforcement channels without a federal request. He paused. But the attempt itself is a federal matter. She looked at the tablet. The query log was there in full. Timestamps, access points, what had been requested, what had been returned, what had been blocked. 11:47, then 11:52, then midnight. 3 separate attempts in 13 minutes. He kept trying, she said. 3 times, with escalating query parameters. Rourke took the tablet back. That's not accidental curiosity. That's deliberate. He looked at her directly. What did he want? She thought about it. Really thought about it. Not the surface answer, but the architecture underneath. I think he wanted something to invalidate me with, she said slowly. A psych flag. A medical discharge notation. Something he could point to that would explain away anything I might say about how he operates. She paused. He's been filing reports against me for a year, all framing me as the problem in encounters where he was the one escalating. Rourke was quiet. He needed the file to complete the picture, she said. Something that would make the reports look like documentation instead of fabrication. And when the query failed, he filed the report anyway, and made it worse because now he was on the record claiming I forced my way into a trauma bay during a mass casualty event. Rourke looked at her for a moment. His face did something that on a less controlled person would have been anger. On him, it was just a slight compression around the jaw. Who needs to receive our documentation, he said. She almost said Dr. Harlan. Then she thought about what Vell's file looked like from the outside. The neat pattern of complaints, all pointing in the same direction. And she thought about how long it had been sitting there unexamined. Everyone? She said. Ugh. The next 2 hours moved in a way that felt both very fast and very slow, which was something she'd experienced before in situations where multiple things were happening simultaneously, and the only way to track them was to stay at the center. Rourke's team occupied a conference room on the 3rd floor that Harlan's assistant cleared in approximately 4 minutes, which was a new record for that kind of room turnover at Hargrove. 3 members of the liaison team worked their own communications, while Rourke managed the interface with hospital leadership. Mara sat in a chair against the wall of the conference room, not removed from it, just outside the operational perimeter, and watched the machinery of accountability start to turn. It was slower than the movies made it look. There were calls that went to voicemail. There were documents that needed to be transmitted in specific formats through specific channels. A JAG officer had to be looped in, which required locating the right JAG officer, which took 20 minutes. The Clover Falls PD's Internal Affairs Office was reached at 8:15, and the conversation Rourke had with them lasted 47 minutes. And she knew it was 47 minutes because she was watching the clock on the wall and tracking it the way she tracked vitals. Not obsessively, but continuously. At 9:03, Gary Ellison walked into the conference room. She hadn't known he was coming. His face when he saw the room, the personnel, the equipment, the formality of the setup, went through several stages in rapid succession. Something that might have been surprise, then something that was unmistakably recognition. He looked at Mara. She looked back. "Gary," she said. He sat down without being invited, which told her something. He sat down the way a man sits down when his legs have made a decision his brain is still catching up to. "The complaints," he said. "The two on file about you. You knew about them. I reviewed them, both times." He put his hands flat on the table. "Both times I concluded they didn't reflect what I'd seen of your conduct, and I noted that in the review. But they stayed on file. The process required—" He stopped, started again. "Yes, they stayed on file." She wasn't angry at him. She'd thought about being angry at him in the last few hours and kept arriving at the same place, which was that Gary Ellison was a man who'd worked within a system that had a process, and the process had limitations, and he'd operated within those limitations in ways that felt procedurally correct and produced an outcome that wasn't. That wasn't the same as what Vel had done. It wasn't the same. But it wasn't nothing either. "He's been doing this to other people," she said. "Hasn't he?" Gary was quiet. "The complaints against me. There's a pattern in how they're written. Specific language, specific framing. That kind of consistency doesn't come from one incident." She paused. "Who else?" He exhaled through his nose. It was a long exhale, the kind that carries more than air. "There are 3 other staff members," he said quietly. "All of them." He stopped. "All of them what?" He looked at his hands. "All of them women. All of them in roles that require them to exercise authority in situations he responds to." The room was quiet. Not the quiet of shock, of arrival. The quiet of something that had been true for a long time finally being said out loud. Rourke was watching from the other side of the table. He didn't intervene. He was good at knowing when not to intervene. "I need their names," Mara said. "Not for me. For whatever process comes next." Gary nodded slowly. "I can get them. And I need you to write down everything you just told me, all of it, in a form that can be submitted." He looked at her for a moment. The look of a man who was deciding what he was, specifically, in this moment. "Okay," he said. It came out like something being set down, heavy and then absent. At 10:21, Marcus Vel arrived at the hospital. She didn't know he was coming until she heard his voice in the hallway outside the conference room. The particular carrying quality of it, the way it assumed whatever space it entered. He was talking to someone, a union rep by the sound of the second voice, and he was using the word protocol repeatedly in a way that suggested he'd been coached on which words to use. She stayed in her chair. The door opened. Vel came in first, then the rep, then Gary, then 2 people from HR whose names she didn't know. Rourke's team arranged themselves without visible effort into positions that took up more of the room than their numbers should have, which was either deliberate or just the way people moved when they'd spent years operating in spaces where positioning mattered. Vel saw her. She watched his face. Not with satisfaction. She was too tired and too clear-headed for satisfaction. With the particular attention she gave to things that were about to become important information. He was surprised to see her. He'd expected her to be somewhere else, or to look different, or she wasn't sure. But the surprise was real. He covered it fast, the way he covered most things, by going slightly louder and more forward. "I have a right to know why military personnel are in this facility." "Sit down, Officer Vel," Rourke said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Vel looked at him. "Who are you?" "Colonel James Rourke, 82nd Airborne Medical Brigade Liaison. Sit down." Vel sat. The union rep tried to say something about procedure. One of Rourke's team members handed him a document without making eye contact, and he stopped talking and started reading, and his expression did something complicated. Rourke placed a tablet on the table, screen up, in the center. The query log. All 3 attempts. Time stamped. Terminal identified. Access categories listed. Officer Vell, Rourke said. At 11:47 p.m. last night, you attempted to access the military medical records of Nurse Mara Solano using a civilian law enforcement terminal. Can you explain why? Vell looked at the screen. He looked at it the way people looked at things they'd assumed would never become visible. I was conducting a standard identity verification. Military psychological evaluations and deployment history are not components of a standard identity verification, Rourke said. Try again. Vell's jaw moved. I had reason to believe there was a security. What reason? Based on her behavior? Describe the behavior. Silence. Specifically, Rourke said, describe the specific behavior that led you to believe accessing a restricted federal record was an appropriate response. The union rep put his hand on Vell's arm. Vell shook it off. She was uncooperative. You've used that word in 2 previous reports about this nurse, Rourke said, both of which described situations that witnesses characterized differently, significantly differently. He paused. I want to be precise with you about what's happening in this room. You attempted to access federal medical records without authorization. That attempt generated an automatic flag with my unit. The flag triggered an investigation which has now uncovered a pattern of conduct reports, all filed by you, all targeting staff members in this facility that do not reflect the events described by witnesses or supported by available recording evidence. He let that sit for a full 3 seconds. This is not a hospital HR meeting. This is the beginning of a federal inquiry. Vell had gone very still. The union rep was still reading. He'd gone several shades paler. Mara was watching Vell's face, and in it she could see the exact moment the architecture collapsed. The moment the story he'd been building, complaint by complaint, report by report, fell in on itself because the foundation had been wrong from the start. He'd built a case against someone he'd assumed would never have the tools to answer it. He'd been precise and patient, and he'd been doing it for over a year, and he had no idea who he was doing it to. She didn't feel triumph. She was too tired for triumph. What she felt was something quieter, the particular satisfaction of a thing being accurately measured after a long time of being measured wrong. Vell looked at her. His expression had shed the aggression. What was left underneath wasn't what she expected. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't shame. It was something she'd seen on other faces in other circumstances. The look of a man who still believed he'd been right, and was only now encountering the problem that belief couldn't fix. You don't belong in there, he said, quietly, almost to himself, like it was something he'd said so many times it had become a fact he lived inside of. You don't belong in that room. She looked at him for a long time. I've been in rooms, she said, that you would not survive. She stood up. Outside in the hallway, she could hear voices multiplying, more people arriving, the hospital's administrative layer activating, the sound of something large and institutional starting to respond to pressure. She could hear her name being said in at least 2 separate conversations she wasn't part of. She needed water. She needed to sit somewhere quiet for 20 minutes. She needed to call her mother, who didn't know any of this was happening, which seemed suddenly and specifically important. She was almost to the door when one of Rourke's team members stopped her. Not physically, just position, the way trained people ask questions with their bodies before their mouths. Lieutenant? He held out a document. There's something you should know before you leave this room. She took it, read the first line, read it again. The world outside the window was fully light now, gray November light, the kind that made everything look like a photograph of itself. And from the hallway she could hear Ron Taggart's voice, and then Anita Marsh's voice, and then a third voice she didn't immediately recognize, a woman, saying something that ended with Mara's full name and her military rank. She looked down at the document in her hands. It wasn't about Vell. It wasn't about last night. It was dated 14 months ago, before she'd ever set foot in Hargrove Memorial, before she'd left the Army, before any of this had started. And it had her name on it. The document was 2 pages. Standard military formatting, the kind she could read in her sleep. Header codes, reference numbers, the particular bureaucratic density of official correspondence that packed meaning into every line if you knew how to look. She knew how to look. It was an incident report, filed 14 months ago through a channel she recognized as the Army's Inspector General's system. The subject line read, "Conduct concern, medical personnel, forward support unit, alleged unauthorized patient contact protocol deviation." The name in the reporting officer field was one she didn't recognize immediately. Then she read it twice, and the context assembled itself. A captain she'd worked under briefly during the transition period before her discharge. A man who'd had opinions about how medical staff should operate in the field and hadn't appreciated that she'd had different opinions backed by better outcomes. A man she'd filed her own concerns about, formally, through the right channels, and had been told the matter was under review and had never heard anything about again. He'd filed this 14 months ago, before she left the Army, before Hargrove. The report alleged that she had violated patient contact protocols during a field medical response by administering treatment decisions beyond her authorized scope without physician oversight. The specific incident described was a decision she remembered clearly. A soldier with a tension pneumothorax who would have died waiting for the physician who was 15 minutes out. She'd done a needle decompression. Textbook. Necessary. The soldier had lived. The report framed it as insubordination. And it had been sitting in her file. Not adjudicated, not dismissed, not investigated. Just sitting, dormant. The kind of unresolved item that didn't affect your record until someone decided it should. Someone like Vel, if he'd been able to access the file. She looked up at Rourke's team member, a woman, mid-30s, who'd handed her the document with the specific expression of someone delivering information they're not sure will land well. "Where did this come from?" Mara said. "It surfaced when we pulled your full record after the flag triggered. It's been in inactive status since filing. No investigation was ever opened. But it's there. It's there." Which means if Vel had gotten into the file, he'd have found an unresolved conduct concern against a military medical officer. Combined with the hospital complaints he'd filed, the woman paused. It would have looked like a pattern. Mara stood with the document in her hands and thought about architecture again. About the patience required to build something like this. Not Vel specifically, because Vel hadn't known about the IG report, he'd just been trying to find it, but the way these things accumulated. An unresolved report from a captain with wounded pride, a year of filed complaints from an officer with a territory problem, all of it pointing the same direction, none of it accurate, and the gap between the record and the reality invisible to anyone who hadn't been there. "I need to make a call," she said. She went into the hallway. The call took 11 minutes. She stood near the window at the end of the administrative corridor, the one that faced east, the one that got morning light even on gray November days, and she talked to a colonel she'd worked with during her second deployment, who now sat on the Army Medical Command's Inspector General Review Board. She'd stayed in touch with him the way you stayed in touch with people who'd seen you work under conditions that made most professional references irrelevant, not regularly, not close, but maintained. She told him about the report. She described the incident. She gave him the case reference number from the header. He was quiet for a moment. "I know that case," he said, "or I know of it. It was flagged internally about 8 months ago as a potential problematic filing because the physician involved submitted a contradictory account." He paused. The physician who was 15 minutes out. She hadn't known about the contradictory account. He filed a supplemental statement saying your intervention was appropriate and likely saved the patient's life, the colonel said. The IG closed the file informally but never issued a formal finding or a clearance notation. It just sat. It sat with an unresolved status attached. Yes. And when someone queries my record, that's what they see. That's what they see. Another pause. Mara, that file needs a formal closure notation, and it should have had one 8 months ago. I can move that today. It'll take time to process, but I can initiate it now. I need it documented that the initiation happened today, she said, with today's timestamp. A beat. He understood what she was asking. Because of the federal inquiry. Because I want a complete record. I'll have it submitted within the hour. She could hear him moving, pulling something up. Are you okay? It was the second time in 12 hours someone had asked her that. She gave him a version of the same answer. "I'll be better when this is done," she said. She hung up, stood at the window. Outside, the parking lot was still holding Rourke's vehicles. She counted them out of habit, 3 SUVs, all present. Below the administrative floor, she could hear the building running, its ordinary volume, and it felt strange to be standing above it while the place went about its business, as if the last 16 hours hadn't happened. Her phone showed 4 missed calls, 2 from numbers she didn't recognize, 1 from Anita Marsh, 1 from Tommy Briggs, which was unexpected. Tommy never called. He texted. She called him back. "Hey." His voice was low, the specific quiet of someone who'd stepped away from a busy area to have a conversation. "Listen, I don't know if you've seen it." "Seen what?" "The video." She waited. "Sarah Kim, she's a night shift nurse. She was in the corridor last night when Vel stopped you the second time, before you went into the bay." Tommy paused. "She posted it. About 2 hours ago. It's moving fast." "How fast?" He told her. The number made her go still in a different way than she'd been still all morning. "People are pretty—" Tommy searched for the word. "Yeah, they're upset." She thought about what she'd said to Vel in that corridor. "You don't know who I am." She thought about whether those words were on the video. She thought about what it meant for them to be circulating in a world that processed things faster than investigations did. "I need to talk to Harlan," she said. "He's been looking for you." "Tell him I'm coming down," said. The video was 43 seconds long. She watched it in Harlan's office on his desktop monitor because he'd pulled it up before she could ask. It started mid-confrontation, the moment in the corridor when she'd been coming out of the supply room and Vel had moved to block her path to the trauma bay. The angle was from behind and to Vel's left, Sarah Kim apparently having had her phone out for an unrelated reason and started recording when the situation escalated. Mara watched herself on the screen. She looked exactly as bad as she'd felt, scrubs still blood-stained, hair pulled back unevenly, gauze visible under tape on her forearm. She looked like someone at the end of 20 hours who was running on the kind of stubborn biological persistence that didn't require sleep to maintain. Vel looked enormous by comparison, positioned forward, hand near his belt. She watched herself say something to him. The audio was slightly muffled, but clear enough. She saw herself step forward and him reach for her arm, and then the trauma bay doors were opening and the gurneys were coming through and the video cut off. The comments section Harlan had scrolled past had the texture of something that had already escaped whatever container it had started in. "We're getting calls," Harlan said, "from the media. 3 local outlets so far, 1 national. The communications office doesn't know what to tell them. Tell them the matter is under active review by multiple agencies, and the hospital is cooperating fully." She paused. "That's accurate, and it gives them nothing to argue with." Harlan looked at her. "Where did you learn to talk like that?" "Army Media Liaison Training, 2 semesters." She paused. "Also, I'm very tired, and it simplifies my options." He almost smiled. Almost. "The police chief called me 20 minutes ago. He wanted to understand the scope of the federal involvement before he made any statements." "What did you tell him?" "I told him to call Colonel Rourke." He closed the browser window. "The union rep for Vel has requested that the hospital produce all documentation of Vel's conduct within this facility going back 3 years. Standard protective move. They want to see what we have before we share it with anyone else." "You don't have to give it to the union rep first." "I'm aware." He sat back. "Legal has already advised the same. We'll be producing everything simultaneously to the PD Internal Affairs Office and the federal inquiry." He paused. "Mara, I want to ask you something directly." She waited. "The other staff members that Gary mentioned, Vel's other complaint targets." He picked up a pen, turned it over in his hands, not writing anything, just something to do with his hands. "Did you know about them before this morning?" She thought about it. "I suspected there were others. The specificity of how his reports were written. It's a template. You don't develop a template on one person. There are 4, in addition to you." He set the pen down. "All women. 3 nurses, 1 physician's assistant. All of them had complaints filed by Vel over the past 18 months. None of them were informed of the filings. Were they reviewed the way mine were? Gary reviewed them. He noted inconsistencies in 2 of them. The other 2, Harlan's expression shifted in a way that meant he was managing something. The other 2 were reviewed by a different administrator who is no longer with this facility. She filed that. I want to talk to them, the 4 of them, before this gets much further into formal process. That can be arranged. He stood, signaling that the conversation had moved into action phase. There's also something else. The father from the accident last night. The man you managed on I-84 before EMS arrived. His name is David Osei. He and his daughter were admitted here. He paused. He's been asking about the nurse who helped him. Wouldn't stop asking, apparently, until Anita went and told him you were on the premises. Something moved through her that was harder to name than anything she'd felt all morning. He's okay? She said. Daughter's fine. He has 2 broken ribs and a concussion, but... Harlan paused. Yes. He's okay. She nodded, didn't say anything. He says he watched you work for 20 minutes on that highway, Harlan said. He says you talked to him the entire time, kept him calm. He says... He stopped, looked at the desk. He says you told him his daughter was okay before you'd even fully assessed her, and he knew you were telling him because you were scared he'd move and hurt himself worse, but it still helped. He looked up. He said it like you'd done something extraordinary. I told him what he needed to hear to keep him still, she said. It came out flat, which wasn't how she meant it. She corrected, and I knew it was probably true. She looked okay. She was. It was still the right thing. She didn't argue with him. She was too tired to be modest and too honest to pretend she didn't know the difference between a good call and a lucky one. That one had been both. By 1 p.m, the conference room on the 3rd floor had become the operational center of something that now involved 5 separate institutional entities: Hargrove Memorial Administration, the Clover Falls PD Internal Affairs Office, the Military Liaison Team, the hospital's legal department, and, as of 11:15, a representative from the State Nursing Board who'd received a complaint from an anonymous source that a nurse at Hargrove had been improperly blocked from responding to a mass casualty event. That last one Mara hadn't anticipated. When Anita told her, she just stood in the hallway and let the information arrive. Someone filed a complaint with the nursing board, she said, about me being blocked. On your behalf, Anita said. Whoever it was framed it as a patient safety concern. The board is required to investigate any complaint that alleges a licensed nurse was prevented from providing emergency care. Do you know who filed it? Anita's expression was careful. I have a guess. Who? Dana Pruitt, the younger officer, the one who'd stood near the entrance last night with the expression of someone who hadn't yet decided what kind of officer she was going to be. Apparently she'd decided. Mara thought about that, about the small decisions people made inside large systems, the ones that cost something and happened anyway. She thought about Pruitt going home last night and sitting with what she'd watched and deciding it wasn't something she could leave alone. Good, she said. It wasn't enough, but it was what she had. Vel had been separated from the conference room proceedings and placed in a waiting area on the 2nd floor with his union rep and what Rourke's team member described, with professional neutrality as significant pending documentation to review. His department had sent a deputy chief, a woman named Hargrove, which was notable only because she shared the hospital's name, which nobody commented on, who'd arrived at noon and gone immediately into a closed-door session with the internal affairs investigator and 2 members of Rourke's team. Mara was not in that meeting. She didn't need to be. She had her own. Gitzek. The 4 women were arranged around the small meeting room on the 2nd floor that HR used for disciplinary conversations, which made it a strange venue for this particular gathering, but it was what was available. 3 nurses and a physician's assistant, ages ranging from 28 to 44. All of them had received the same call from Anita Marsh. Could you come in for a conversation this afternoon? And all of them had agreed, and Mara could see in their faces as she came in that at least 2 of them already knew or suspected why they were there. She sat down, didn't position herself at the head of the table because this wasn't that kind of meeting. I'm Mara Solano, she said. I'm a nurse in this facility. You probably know my name from this morning. They did. She could see it. I found out today that Officer Vel filed conduct reports against each of you, the same way he filed them against me. I'm guessing none of you were officially informed." She watched their faces. Two of them, the two younger nurses, looked at each other. "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want to be clear. You don't have to answer any of them right now, and you don't have to answer them to me. There are formal processes with people who have more authority than I do to collect this, but I wanted—" She paused. "I wanted you to hear it from someone who was in the same position, before it goes into a room full of administrators and lawyers." Silence. Then one of them, the physician's assistant, a woman named Reyes, 40-ish, with the self-possession of someone who'd been in medical settings long enough to stop being impressed by titles, said, "What did yours say?" "That I was uncooperative and escalated situations where he was the one escalating." Reyes made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Mine said I failed to comply with officer instructions during a patient restraint situation," she said, "which would have resulted in a patient who was in respiratory distress having his wrists bound while he was trying to breathe. I told Vel to back away from the patient, and he didn't like that." She looked at her hands. "I didn't know there was a report." "None of us knew," said the youngest of the three nurses. "Early 30s, name tag," said Garcia. Her voice was carefully level. "He files them, and they sit there and we don't know, and if nothing ever happens, we never find out. But if something does happen—" "The file exists," Mara said. "The file exists?" Garcia sat back. "And we look like the problem." The meeting lasted 40 minutes. She asked careful questions, and they answered them with the particular precision of people who'd been managing something difficult and alone, and were only now being given a context for it. All four incidents were different in their details and identical in their structure. Vel overreaching, medical staff pushing back within appropriate bounds, Vel filing paperwork that inverted the sequence. All four women had made the same calculation she'd made, that engaging formally with the complaint process was more dangerous than absorbing it, because engaging meant drawing attention to yourself in a system that hadn't shown them it was safe to do that. She understood that calculation. She'd made it herself. "The difference now," she told them, "is that there are 5 of us on record plus a federal query log, plus body cam requests, plus the video. The pattern isn't something that needs to be argued. It's documentable." She looked around the table. "What I need to know is whether each of you is willing to provide a formal statement." 4 people looked at her. 3 of them said yes immediately. Reyes took a moment, then, "I've been here for 9 years. I've watched this facility operate, and I've watched how it handles things that are uncomfortable. I want to know who reviews those statements. Internal affairs, the federal inquiry, potentially the nursing board, possibly legal proceedings. Will it matter?" Mara looked at her. "It already matters," she said. "I think that's why you're scared." Reyes was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes, I'll give a statement." At 3:15, Deputy Chief Hargrove, the woman from Vel's department, knocked on the door of the 3rd-floor conference room where Mara was sitting with Rourke, reviewing the IG documentation from her military file. She came in alone. That was notable. No lawyer, no union presence, no one to perform for. She was somewhere around 50, with the specific kind of tired that came from managing a department through a situation it had created for itself. She looked at Mara the way people looked when they were preparing to say something they'd had to talk themselves into. "I want to speak to you directly," she said, "if that's acceptable." Mara looked at Rourke. He gave her a slight nod. "Your call." "Sit down," she said. Hargrove sat. She folded her hands on the table in a gesture that was either composed or performing composure. The difference mattered, but Mara wasn't sure yet which this was. "Officer Vel has been with our department for 6 years, she said. "In that time we have received—" She paused, and the pause had something in it. "We have received concerns about his conduct, informally, through channels that don't generate formal records." "How many?" Mara said. "I'm not able to give you a complete number." "Estimate." Hargrove was quiet for 3 seconds. "More than 3. Fewer than 10. "In 6 years?" "Yes. And none of them became formal records. The complainants—" She stopped, reconsidered. "The people who raised concerns opted not to formalize them. for various reasons. For the same reason people don't formalize things when they're not sure it'll go anywhere and they're worried it'll come back to them, Mara said. Her voice was even, not cruel, accurate. Hargrove didn't disagree. What I'm here to tell you, she said, is that the department is not going to obstruct this process. The body cam footage has been released to Internal Affairs. All of it, last night and the 2 previous incidents at this facility. She looked at the table. There's a 3rd incident at a different medical facility in Clover Falls, 18 months ago. We became aware this morning that a formal complaint was filed at that facility and was not transmitted to us. Mara went still. A different facility. Ridgecroft Clinic. A nurse there filed a complaint following a security response situation. The clinic's administration at the time, the administrator is no longer in that role, made a determination not to forward it to our department. So it hadn't started at Hargrove. Hargrove had been phase 2. I need that complaint, Mara said. It's being transmitted now. Hargrove looked up. I want to be honest with you. We should have caught this. The informal concerns, the pattern across facilities. We should have caught it, and we didn't. She paused. I don't have a good explanation for that. I have some explanations, but they're not good ones. Mara looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the cost of what hadn't been caught, not in abstract terms, but in the specific terms of 5 women sitting in a room agreeing to give formal statements about things they'd carried alone for months and years. The cost wasn't hypothetical. It had addresses. What's going to happen to him? She said. He's been suspended pending the internal investigation. Given the federal dimension and the video and the volume of documentation, Hargrove paused. I can't make you a promise I don't have the authority to keep. But I can tell you that what we've seen today is not the kind of thing that results in reinstatement. Mara nodded once. It wasn't satisfaction. Nothing about this felt clean enough for satisfaction, but it was something. The beginning of an accounting. Hargrove stood. Then she stopped. One more thing, she said. Officer Pruitt, the officer who was present last night. She said it carefully, watching Mara's face. She filed an internal report this morning. In addition to the nursing board complaint, she documented what she observed last night and explicitly stated that she should have intervened and didn't. Another pause. She's requested to be reassigned off the hospital liaison rotation. Is she in trouble for filing? No, the opposite. Hargrove paused. She's 26. She's been on the job 14 months. Something moved across her face that was hard to name, not quite pride, something more complicated. She made the right call even though it cost her something. Mara thought about Pruitt standing near the entrance in the rain, the expression of someone still deciding. She'd decided. After Hargrove left, Mara sat in the conference room for a moment with no particular task in front of her, which was a strange and slightly disorienting condition. The last 24 hours had been so continuously active that stillness felt incorrect, like a wrong answer. Rourke was across the table reviewing something on his tablet. His team members were in and out. The building hummed below. Colonel, she said. He looked up. The incident report from Captain, from the IG file. She'd decided she didn't need to name him. It's going to get formal closure today. I know, I received the notification. He paused. For what it's worth. What you did with that patient. The needle decompression. I reviewed the field report at the time. It was the right call. I know it was. He almost smiled. Almost. Yes, you always did. She stood up. Her legs had the specific quality of legs that had been asked to do more than legs are designed to do on a given day. She needed to eat something. She needed to sleep for approximately 12 years. She needed to call her mother. She was reaching for her jacket when her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. Oregon area code, but not local to Clover Falls. She answered. Is this Mara Solano? A woman's voice. Professional, careful. This is Diane Sato. I'm a reporter with the Northwest Regional Examiner. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about... I'm not making any statements to media at this time, Mara said. Standard. Clean. I understand. I just wanted you to know I've been reporting on Officer Vell for 7 months. A pause. independent of what happened last night. There's a pattern that goes back further than Hargrove Memorial, and I have documentation." Mara stopped moving. "How long have you been working on it?" she said slowly. 7 months. There are 3 other facilities, 2 in Oregon, 1 in Washington State. The reporter's voice was steady, not performing urgency, actually steady, the voice of someone who'd been sitting with a story long enough to be patient with it. "I filed public records requests with 4 police departments. I've interviewed 11 people." A pause. "I have his personnel file, Ms. Solano, all of it, including a disciplinary review from 4 years ago that was closed without action. 4 years ago. Before Hargrove. Before Ridgecroft. Before all of it." "What was the review?" Mara said. The reporter told her. She stood in the conference room with her jacket in her hand and listened to the shape of the thing she'd been living inside of, the true shape of it, not the piece she'd been able to see from where she was standing, but the full architecture, which was older and larger and more deliberate than she'd understood until this moment. When Diane Sato finished speaking, the room was very quiet. "Ms. Solano?" the reporter said. "Are you still there?" "I'm still here," she said. Her hand had gone tight on the phone. She made herself loosen it. "I need to make one call before I decide whether to talk to you," she said. "Can I reach you back in 30 minutes? "Yes." She hung up, stood very still. 4 years ago, Marcus Vell had been subject to a formal departmental review. A review that had found, according to the reporter, according to the records she claimed to have, that he'd engaged in a pattern of conduct targeting specific staff members at medical facilities during security response calls. A review that had recommended additional supervision and mandatory training. A review that the department had closed with a notation that the matter had been addressed through internal counseling. No suspension, no formal record in his personnel file. Internal counseling, which in practice meant a conversation that generated a document that then traveled nowhere. And then he'd continued. For 4 more years he'd continued, Ridgecroft, then Hargrove, then last night, building his files and writing his complaints, and trying to access federal records on a woman he'd identified as a problem, and every step of it had been supported by the foundation of a department that had known and chosen to call it addressed. She thought about the deputy chief sitting across from her saying, "We should have caught this." They had caught it, once, 4 years ago, and then they'd put it away. She thought about the 5 women in that room on the 2nd floor. She thought about the nurse at Ridgecroft, whose complaint had been absorbed by an administrator who no longer worked there. She thought about the 11 people the reporter had interviewed, and she thought about the number 11 the way she'd been thinking about numbers all night, as representing something real, something with faces and names and costs. She picked up her phone and called Rourke. He answered on the 2nd ring. "There's a reporter," she said, "Northwest Regional Examiner. She's been working on Vell independently for 7 months. She has his full personnel file and documentation from 3 other facilities and a departmental review from 4 years ago." Silence on his end. Then, "The department knew. 4 years ago they reviewed him and closed it." Another silence. Longer. She could hear him thinking, the particular quality of Rourke's silences, which were never empty. "Talk to her," he said. "You're sure?" "The federal inquiry covers last night and the credential query. What she has covers 4 years. He paused. "Mara, that's not a story about you. That's a story about a system." She knew he was right. She'd known it before she called him, but she'd needed someone else to say it. "I'll call you after," she said. She hung up, pulled her jacket on, picked up her phone. She was about to call Diane Sato back when the door opened and Anita Marsh came in with an expression she'd learned to read over 3 years. Not calm, not alarmed, something between them that meant the situation had developed. "What?" Mara said. "David Osei," Anita said. "The father from the accident." She paused. "He's been talking to people. The other patients from last night's crash. The bus passengers, some of the others." She paused again. "One of them had their phone out when you came into the trauma bay last night. When Vell reached for your arm and you went through the door." Mara looked at her. "It's already been shared," Anita said. "A lot." "How much is a lot?" Anita turned her phone around. The number on the screen had 8 digits. Mara looked at it, looked at her phone in her other hand, looked at the door Anita had come through, the building beyond it, the world that the building sat inside of. 8 digits in 14 hours. From a 43-second video and now whatever this second one showed. She thought about what Rourke had said. That's not a story about you. She thought about the 5 women in the room downstairs. She thought about the reporter with 7 months of documents and 11 interviews. She thought about the review from 4 years ago, closed without action, filed somewhere it couldn't be seen. She thought about all the things that had been made invisible and what it took to make them visible again. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A text from a number she didn't recognize, then a second from the same number, then a third. She looked at the screen. The first text was from a name she hadn't thought about in over a year. A name from the hospital in Portland where she'd done her civilian nursing certification. A colleague she'd worked alongside in the first year after leaving the Army, someone she hadn't kept in regular contact with. Mara. Seeing your name everywhere. Are you okay? The second, also I need to tell you something. We had an incident here 6 months ago. Officer from Clover Falls PD, liaison rotation. I didn't connect it until now. The third, the one that made her go still in the middle of the conference room with Anita watching her. I filed a complaint. They told me it had been forwarded to the department. Mara, I think you should know the officer's name. She read the name in the 4th text. It wasn't Marcus Vell. The name in the 4th text was Lieutenant Ray Colton. She read it twice. Then she pulled up the department directory on her phone, the Clover Falls PD liaison roster that Hargrove's security office kept on file, and she found him in 11 seconds. Ray Colton, 41, 6 years with the department, assigned to hospital liaison rotation. The same rotation as Vell. She showed the phone to Anita without saying anything. Anita read it. Her expression did the thing it did when she was processing something and didn't want to show how hard she was working to process it. They worked together, Anita said. Same rotation, same facilities. Mara was already typing back to her contact in Portland, a nurse named Bev Hadley, who'd been one of the steadiest people she'd worked alongside in her first civilian year. She said the complaint was forwarded to the department, which means the department received a complaint about a liaison officer from a second officer on the same rotation, and did nothing. She finished the text, sent it. I need Rourke. She needed Rourke, and she needed Diane Sato, and she needed about 4 more hours she didn't have. What she had was a body that had been awake for 23 hours, a forearm that was going to scar if she didn't look at it properly, and a situation that had just doubled in size. Rourke was in the conference room. She came through the door without knocking and put her phone on the table in front of him, screen up, Bev's texts visible. He read them. His jaw did the compression thing. He looked up. Colton, he said. Same rotation. There's a complaint from Portland 6 months ago that was forwarded to the department. Then the department received 2 separate complaints about the rotation within, he calculated, within the last 18 months, and closed both without action. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Not the thinking quiet, something harder. The quiet of a man who'd spent his career in institutions and understood exactly what it meant when an institution absorbed information and chose what to do with it. This goes to the district attorney, he said. Today? I'm calling now. He picked up his phone, looked at her once before he dialed, a look she recognized from the field, the specific look of someone confirming that you're solid before the next thing starts. You did the right things tonight, every single one. She didn't say anything. She went to find Diane Sato's number, Bond. The call with the reporter lasted 22 minutes. Mara sat in an empty patient consultation room on the 2nd floor, small, neutral, the kind of space designed to receive difficult news. And she talked. She didn't tell Sato everything. There were things inside active investigations that weren't hers to release, and she knew the lines well enough not to cross them. But she told her what she could. Her own experience, in sequence, with the specific factual detail that made a story more than a grievance. She told her about the rain and the 23 minutes. She told her about the trauma bay and the 11 patients and the report that described it as a security breach. She told her about the credential query and the IG file and the 5 women in the room downstairs. Sato listened without interrupting, which was the quality that separated good reporters from the others. When Mara finished, Sato said, "Can I ask you something that isn't about the story?" "You can ask." "Why are you talking to me? You could have kept this inside the formal processes. Let the investigations run." Mara thought about it. She could have given a strategic answer about public record, about accountability, about the value of journalism in cases involving institutional misconduct. All of it would have been true. Instead, she said, "Because the formal processes are the reason this went on for 4 years. The complaints existed, the review existed, the informal concerns existed. They all went into the right channels, and the right channels absorbed them." She paused. "I don't think the formal processes fail because the people inside them are all bad. I think they fail because they're built to protect the institution first. And an institution protecting itself and an institution protecting people are not the same thing." She paused again. "You have 7 months of documentation. You have 11 sources. That's not something I can build inside a conference room." Sato was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that." "Get it right," Mara said. That's all I need." She hung up, sat in the small room for a moment. Outside the window, the November afternoon was doing what November afternoons did in Oregon, graying out, the light dropping early, the kind of dusk that arrived before you were ready for it. She called her mother. Her mother answered on the 3rd ring with the specific alarm of a woman who knew her daughter did not call in the middle of a workday without reason. "Mara, what happened?" "I'm okay," she said, "but I need to tell you about last night." She told her. All of it, roughly, the way you told things to people who'd known you your whole life. Not in sequence, not tidied up, but in the actual order that it mattered. The accident first, because that was the part her mother needed to understand was what she was, regardless of everything that followed. Then Vel. Then the mass casualty response. Then the morning. Her mother was quiet for a long time after she finished. "Are you going to be on the news?" she said finally. Despite everything, Mara felt something in her chest loosen. Probably. "I'm going to need to know what to tell your aunt. She'll see it." "Tell her the truth. I helped people and someone tried to make that a problem and it didn't work." Her mother made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and something fiercer. "You sound tired." "I'm very tired." "Then go sleep." "I have things to—" "Mara." Her mother's voice went quiet in the way it went quiet when she was done negotiating. "You did enough today. Whatever is left will still be there after you sleep." She stayed on the phone for another few minutes, not really talking, just present. Sometimes that was what people needed from each other. Not solutions, not advice, not even words. Just the sound of someone who wasn't going anywhere. When she hung up, she sat for another moment. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and went back to work. The next 72 hours were not clean. She hadn't expected them to be. The Clover Falls PD placed both Marcus Vell and Ray Colton on administrative suspension within 18 hours of Rourke's call to the district attorney's office. The formal announcement came from Deputy Chief Hargrove at a press briefing that Mara watched on her phone from her apartment couch at 10 a.m. the following morning, having finally gone home, having finally slept 6 hours, which wasn't enough, but was what her body accepted before pulling her back to consciousness. Hargrove stood at a podium and used the specific language of institutional accountability, which was to say she used a lot of words that meant the right things without quite admitting the size of the failure they were describing. Mara watched and thought about what Rourke had said, a story about a system, and thought about how systems talked about themselves when the talking was unavoidable. The district attorney's office had opened a formal misconduct investigation covering both officers. The scope included Vell's unauthorized credential query, the falsified conduct reports across multiple facilities, the suppressed complaint from Portland, and the 4-year-old departmental review that had generated a conversation and nothing else. Diane Sato's story ran the same morning as the press briefing. It was a long piece, the kind that took 7 months to report and showed it, every paragraph placed with the deliberateness of someone who'd handled the material long enough to know exactly where it landed hardest. It named both officers. It named the 3 facilities. It included testimony from 6 of the 11 sources, all named, all specific. It included excerpts from the 4-year-old review document that described Vell's pattern in language so clear it was almost impossible to understand how anyone had filed it away. Mara was mentioned in it, but she wasn't the story. The story was what it was supposed to be. By noon, the piece had been picked up by 2 national outlets. By 3 p.m., the Clover Falls PD Union had released a statement saying they were cooperating with the investigation and taking the concerns raised extremely seriously, which was the statement unions released when they understood that the alternative was worse. Gary Ellison submitted his formal statement that afternoon, a document that was longer and more candid than she'd expected, acknowledging his own role in the chain, the reviews he'd conducted that had noted inconsistencies without escalating them, the procedural correctness that had produced an incorrect outcome. She read it because Anita forwarded it to her without comment. She read it twice. It was not the statement of a man trying to minimize, it was the statement of a man trying to be accurate about himself, which was harder and worth more. She didn't call him. She filed it. On the 4th day after the crash, Hargrove Memorial's administration convened a meeting that included Mara, Anita Marsh, Dr. Harlan, the hospital's chief legal officer, 2 board members, and a woman from the state nursing board who'd traveled up from Salem for it. They sat around the long conference table on the 3rd floor, the same room that had held Rourke's team, now rearranged into something more institutional, the windows showing a November afternoon that had finally given up on rain and gone gray and dry. Harlan spoke first. He was formal in the way of someone who'd prepared for this conversation carefully, which she'd expected. He was the kind of person who prepared. We've reviewed the conduct of both officers and the hospital's response across all documented incidents, he said. We've also reviewed our internal processes for handling security liaison conduct concerns. He paused. There are failures here that belong to this institution. The complaint review process did not protect staff adequately. The security liaison protocols did not have sufficient oversight mechanisms. And at least 2 staff members raised informal concerns about Officer Vell that were never entered into any formal channel. He looked at her. That's on us, he said. Not all of it, but enough of it. She nodded. She wasn't going to tell him it was fine because it wasn't. She wasn't going to perform graciousness about institutional failure. But she recognized the difference between a person who was accounting for something and a person who was performing accounting, and Harlan was doing the first one. What changes? She said. He slid a folder across the table. She opened it. It was a policy framework. New protocols for security liaison conduct review. Mandatory body cam footage. Submission for any incident involving patient care staff. An independent reporting channel for staff concerns that bypass the direct chain. A review board that included nursing representation. Response timelines. Documentation requirements. An annual audit by a third party with no institutional ties. She read it the way she read medical protocols, looking for gaps, for places where the language got soft, for the difference between a policy that protected people and a policy that protected the institution from claims that it hadn't. Page 7, she said. The independent reporting channel. Who administers it? We're proposing an external patient safety organization. One that has hospital accreditation relationships? A pause. Harlan looked at the legal officer. There's an inherent, if the body that receives the complaints also evaluates your accreditation, there's a structural conflict, she said. The channel needs to be genuinely independent. Otherwise, in 5 years, it becomes the same channel that exists now, just with a different name. Silence around the table. The nursing board representative, a woman named Fong, who'd been mostly quiet, said, She's right. Harlan looked at the legal officer. The legal officer made a note. They worked through the rest of it. Not quickly. 1 hour and 40 minutes, which was the time it took to go through a policy document in the specific way that meant something. She pushed back on 3 other sections. She agreed with 12. She asked for 2 additions that weren't in the draft, one of which Harlan accepted immediately, and one of which the legal officer flagged for further review. When it was done, Harlan looked at her across the table. I want to offer you something, he said, formally. A role in developing and overseeing the implementation of these protocols. Compensated, with protected time built into your schedule. He paused. You don't have to decide now. She thought about it. She thought about what she was, a nurse specifically, someone whose primary reason for being in a building like this was the patients on the other side of the clinical wall. She thought about whether sitting in policy meetings was the thing she was supposed to be doing with the particular set of skills she had. Then she thought about the 5 women in the room on the second floor. She thought about Bev Hadley in Portland. She thought about the nurse at Ridgecroft, whose complaint had been absorbed. Yes, she said, but I keep my patient load. This is additional, not replacement. Agreed. And I want the other 4 staff members included in the implementation process. They have direct experience with the failure modes. They should be in the room. Harlan nodded. Also agreed. On the 6th day, the district attorney's office announced that a grand jury had been convened to consider charges against both Vell and Colton. The charges being considered included official misconduct, falsification of government records, and unauthorized access to restricted federal databases. The last charge carried federal weight, which meant the scope of potential consequences was larger than any departmental review could have produced. She heard about it from Rourke, who called her briefly. The JAG officer submitted the full credential query documentation to the federal side this morning, he said. It's clean. Every attempt logged, every access category specified, the terminal registration unambiguous. He paused. There's no version of this where Vell claims it was accidental. What about the 4-year-old review, she said. The department that sat on it. That's in the DA's scope. Whether anyone inside the department faces accountability for the suppression, that's a longer road. His voice was honest about that. Not resigned, just accurate. Institutions are harder to charge than individuals, but the documentation exists and it's part of the record. It was, she understood, the best answer available. Not complete, not clean. But the documentation existed, and that was not nothing. Documentation that hadn't existed publicly 4 days ago, that had been sitting in a file somewhere accumulating weight it was never supposed to accumulate. Rourke, she said. Yeah. The IG file, the closure notation. Processed and on record as of 48 hours ago, he said. Formal finding, intervention was appropriate, within scope, and reflected sound clinical judgment under field conditions. He paused. It should have said that 8 months ago. I'm sorry it didn't. She held the phone for a moment. Outside her apartment window, the city was doing what cities did, moving, indifferent to the specific weight of any particular moment inside it. It says it now, she said. She went back to full clinical duty on day 7. The shift started at 7 a.m., which meant she was up at 5:30, which was normal. She made coffee that was slightly too strong, which was also normal. She drove to Hargrove in the early morning dark, parked in the employee lot, badged through the employee entrance. The ER at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday had the particular energy of handoff, the night crew tired and ready to leave, the day crew arriving with the temporary alertness of people who'd slept. She knew everyone on both sides. She'd worked with most of them for years. Tommy Briggs was finishing his overnight. He was charting at the nurse's station with the 1,000-yard concentration of someone who'd been doing this for 7 hours and had 4 forms left to complete. He looked up when she came in. Hey, he said. Hey, you doing okay? Yeah. She pulled up the dayboard. What are we looking at? He handed her the rundown without further commentary, which was exactly what she needed. Not ceremony, not acknowledgement, just the work. She took the rundown and started reading. There was a 9-year-old in Bay 3 with a suspected appendicitis who'd been waiting on surgical consult. There was a 40-year-old woman in Bay 6 with chest pain that was probably musculoskeletal and needed ruling out. There was a diabetic patient in observation whose overnight glucose had been erratic and needed reassessing before he could be discharged. She put the rundown on the desk and went to Bay 3 first, because 9-year-olds with suspected appendicitis were more time-sensitive than anything else on the board, and also because the particular anxiety of a child in pain in an ER required a specific kind of attention that she was good at and knew she was good at. The child's name was Marco. He was small for 9, dark-eyed, and had the expression of a person trying very hard not to cry in front of people he didn't know. His mother was next to the bed holding his hand with both of hers, in the grip of someone trying to transmit calm she didn't fully have. "Marco," Mara said. She pulled a stool over and sat at his level, not looming, not clinical and vertical. "I'm going to press on your stomach in a few places. I need you to tell me where it hurts the most. Can you do that?" He nodded, serious. "You know what helps," she said, starting the assessment, "is rating it, like a number. If 1 is barely anything and 10 is the worst thing ever, where are we right now?" He thought about it. 6, he said. "Maybe 7. Okay, 7 is real information. That's helpful." She worked through the assessment. He was precise about his answers, pointing to the location specifically, specifying the quality of the pain when she asked, not dramatizing, not minimizing. He was a kid who paid attention. Halfway through, she became aware that his mother was watching her. Not with anxiety, with something else. Recognition, almost. The look of someone who'd seen something like this before and was grateful to be seeing it again. When she finished, she explained what was happening in language Marco could follow, what the next steps were, what would happen if the surgical consult confirmed what she suspected. She told him he'd been a good patient, which was true, and which she said because true things were worth saying. Outside the bay, the mother caught her arm. "Thank you," she said. Then, "I saw the video. From the other night." Mara looked at her. The woman paused. She was searching for something and not finding the right words, which was honest. "I'm glad you were there. In the bay. I'm glad they didn't—" She stopped. "Your son's going to be okay," Mara said. "That's the part that matters right now." The woman nodded. Let go of her arm. Mara went to Bay 6. In the weeks that followed, the machinery of consequence moved at the speed it moved, which was not fast and was not always satisfying, but was real. The grand jury returned indictments against both Vell and Colton 8 weeks after the incident. Vell faced 4 counts: official misconduct, 2 counts of falsification of government records, and unauthorized access to restricted federal records. Colton faced 2 counts related to the suppressed Portland complaint and his role in a pattern the DA's investigation had documented across a longer timeline than anyone had initially understood. Neither indictment made the news the way the original video had. That was the nature of process. It was slower and quieter and less photogenic than the moment that started it. She understood that. She didn't need the DA's press release to trend online to know it was real. Gary Ellison remained head of security at Hargrove. She thought about whether she wanted that, had sat with her own feeling about it, and tried to identify what was honest. What she arrived at was this: Gary had made procedural choices that had real costs, and he'd been honest about it in his statement, and what she needed from him going forward was different from what she'd needed from him before. She'd told him that directly, in a conversation in his office that lasted 15 minutes and was uncomfortable for most of them. "I need you to escalate things that are uncomfortable," she said. "Not when they're already obvious, before." "I know," he said. "That's not an apology request," she said. "That's what I need from you going forward." He looked at her. "I understand." She believed him. Not because she trusted him perfectly. She didn't, not anymore. Not in the uncomplicated way she'd trusted him before. But because people were capable of learning things through cost, and she'd seen it happen, and the work of the policy implementation was better with him in it than without him. She wasn't going to pretend the reset was free, but she was going to do the work. The 4 other staff members, Reyes and Garcia, and the 2 others whose names had been filed in the formal record, were brought into the protocol implementation process, as Mara had requested. Their involvement was not ceremonial. Reyes turned out to have precise opinions about documentation requirements and a gift for identifying where a policy's language created the appearance of protection without the substance. Garcia was 29 years old and was going to be running something significant in 10 years, which was visible if you paid attention. They met twice a month in the conference room on the 3rd floor. It was less formal than the initial meetings had been. People brought coffee, there was usually something to argue about. The conversation ran over time regularly. Mara ran the meetings and ran them the way she ran a trauma response. Clear on the priority, open about the problem, hard on the process, and specific about the decisions. It was not glamorous work. There was nothing cinematic about reviewing complaint intake procedures or debating the language of a reporting timeline requirement, but it was the work that meant the next person would have somewhere to go. And that was the thing she kept coming back to when the meetings were long and the language was dry and the institutional resistance was doing what institutional resistance did. The next person. That was the whole point. What? 3 months after the crash on I-84, David Osei was discharged from the last of his follow-up appointments. His ribs had healed. His daughter Amara, who was 4 and had sustained no injuries that left any physical mark, had started asking to be a doctor when she grew up, which her father reported to Mara in a text with 3 exclamation points and a photo of Amara in a toy doctor's kit that had clearly been purchased recently and enthusiastically. Mara looked at the photo for a long time. Amara was wearing a plastic stethoscope and grinning with the absolute confidence of someone who had fully committed to the bit. She texted back, "Tell her she'd be good at it." David texted back, "She said she wants to be the kind that helps people when they're scared. I told her there's a name for that." She put her phone down, picked it up, looked at the photo again. There was no clean line between the person she'd been on that highway shoulder and the person she was now. No moment where the work became worth it or the cost got paid off or the accounting balanced. Life didn't run that way, and she'd known that long enough not to expect it. What there was, instead, was a child in a toy stethoscope. A room full of women revising a policy that would outlast the circumstances that created it. A reporter's article that had generated, according to Diane Sato's follow-up email, 17 contacts from people at other facilities in 3 other states who'd recognized something in it. 17 contacts. From one story. From one set of documents that had sat in a file for 4 years, waiting for someone to pull them into the light. She thought about what it cost to pull things into the light. She'd learned the cost specifically over the last 3 months, not abstractly, but in the particular currency of what it actually required. The 23 minutes in the rain, the corridor, the choice to go through the trauma bay doors, the choice to answer the reporter's call, the choice to sit in the policy meetings and push on the language of page 7. None of it had felt heroic in the moment. Most of it had felt like the obvious next step, if you were the kind of person who did the obvious next step. She was that kind of person. She'd always been that kind of person, even when she'd wished, occasionally, that she wasn't. In April, 5 months after the night on I-84, the Oregon State Nursing Board's annual safety symposium invited her to speak. She almost said no. She was not, by nature or by preference, someone who stood at a podium and talked about herself. She'd given enough briefings in enough context to know how to speak in public. But there was a difference between briefing and testifying, between explaining and being witnessed, and the second kind had always made her uncomfortable in a way the first never had. She said yes because Reyes told her to. "You don't have to tell them your whole story," Reyes said. They were in the conference room, end of a policy meeting, the table covered in the organized debris of a 2-hour working session. "Tell them the part that's useful, the part that helps somebody in a room somewhere figure out what to do." "I don't know what that part is," Mara said. "Yes, you do." Reyes looked at her with the directness of someone who'd decided they were past being polite about things they were clear on. "You always knew what to do, even when the system was telling you to stand down, even when everyone around you was choosing the easier thing." She paused. "That's not a gift. That's a decision you kept making. Tell them about the decision." She stood at the podium in a conference room in Portland, Oregon, on a Thursday morning in April, in front of 300 nurses and nursing administrators from across the Pacific Northwest. She wore her regular clothes, not a uniform, not anything ceremonial. She'd decided that specifically. She was showing up as what she was. She talked for 22 minutes. She talked about the crash on I-84 briefly, because that was where it started. She talked about the 23 minutes in the rain, about the choice to go back into the building when she heard the mass casualty alert, about the decision to answer the reporter's call. She talked about what it felt like to know that something was wrong and to understand that naming it came with a cost, and to name it anyway, not because she was brave, she said, but because the alternative was worse. The alternative, she said, was leaving the next person without a record, without documentation, without the knowledge that they weren't the first and they weren't alone. She paused. The 5 women in that room with me, they'd each been carrying something in isolation. When we put it together, it had a different shape. The shape of a pattern is a kind of evidence that individual complaints aren't. She looked at the room. You are not alone in what you're carrying, and the thing you're carrying is not yours to carry alone. She talked about the policy work. She talked about page 7 and why the language mattered. She talked about what it meant to build a channel that was actually independent instead of independently named. She didn't talk about Vel by name. The legal proceedings were ongoing, and she wasn't interested in the podium for that purpose. She didn't tell the room that she was a combat veteran, or that she had military commendations, or that she'd served in places that had tested her in ways no one in civilian life would ever be asked to be tested. She'd considered including it. There was a version of the speech where it was context that explained her particular stubbornness. She'd cut it. It wasn't the point. The point was that she'd made decisions. Decisions were replicable. Credentials weren't. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. She stood at the podium and let it land, not performing modesty, not deflecting it, just receiving it the way you received anything real. It had weight. She let it have weight. Afterward, in the hallway outside the conference room, a young nurse found her. 24, maybe 25, still in the first years of the job. She had the look of someone who'd been building up to something. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yeah." "What do you do when you report something and it doesn't go anywhere? Like, I have a situation at my facility and I filed a concern and the supervisor said it was noted and then..." She stopped. "Nothing. 3 months." Mara looked at her. She was tired, still, the particular sustained tiredness of someone who'd been doing hard things for a long season. But she was also here, in this hallway, and this woman had a question that was real. "You document the fact that you filed," she said. "Date, time, who received it, exact language of their response. You keep a copy somewhere that isn't the institutional system." She paused. "And then you find out if there's anyone else." "Anyone else? Who's noticed the same thing? Who's chosen not to say it out loud yet?" She looked at her. "Patterns require more than one data point. One person noticing something is a concern. 2 is a pattern. 3 is documentation." The young woman was writing something on her phone. She looked up. "What if I can't find anyone else?" "Then you're the first data point," Mara said. "That's still something." She walked out of the building into April light. Not warm yet, not in Oregon in April, but real. Present. The kind of light that didn't make promises but showed up anyway. She'd stopped expecting things to be clean a long time ago. Clean was a fantasy that got in the way of actual work. What she'd learned, was still learning, would be learning for as long as she did this, was that the work itself was the point. Not the resolution, not the vindication, not the podium. The decision to go back into the building when the sirens changed. The decision to push on the language of a policy document. The decision to answer a young nurse's question in a hallway. She had a shift in 2 days. She had a policy meeting next week. She had a text from Bev Hadley in Portland saying her own facility had opened a formal misconduct review based on documentation they'd been helped to compile by Diane Sato's follow-up reporting. She had Marco, the 9-year-old with the appendicitis, who'd sent her a drawing through the hospital mail system. A crayon figure in blue scrubs with a name tag that said Mara, standing very tall, which she'd put on her refrigerator and was, objectively, the best piece of art in her apartment. She got in her car, started the engine. The city moved around her, indifferent and real, and full of people who had no idea what had happened in the last 5 months and were going about the business of their ordinary lives, which were full of their own costs and their own decisions and their own quiet, unremarked moments of choosing to do the harder thing. She pulled out of the parking structure. She drove. The work was the point. It had always been the point, and she was not done.